So welcome everyone. We are here back at SRAP Live. We have a very important panel today. The panel is emissions and why it matters. And we're going to talk about some things that emissions from Capos, their infrastructure, how the Federal Clean Air Act can be used to regulate these processes. So I have with me here some dynamic women, all of whom I love and are mentors to me. We have Danielle Diamond, who is our Director of Field Operations with Socially Responsible Agriculture Project. Danny is an attorney, a community organizer, and an environmental policy advocate that has more than a decade of experience confronting these critical threats. And if you want somebody in your corner, Danny is the one, because she stops at nothing to get justice for the communities. We also have with us Kathy Martin, who Kathy actually helped me with my family many years ago. For those of you that know my history, our family was exposed, and there were times when I was calling Kathy, I don't know what time of night, pulling my kid out of the tub with blisters and dizzy in my house from the emissions. And there was not only a great friend on the phone, but there was also someone who was so experienced. Kathy's had 23 years working in Capo issues, and that includes the evaluation of livestock production waste management systems, lagoons, liner designs, nutrient management plans, water pollution controls, air pollution regs and controls. Kathy has a very unique background because she has worked within agencies as well as within communities, which gives her a very unique perspective. Kathy's worked, I think it's 24 states, so she's very familiar with the various regulations. She has a BS in petroleum engineering, and she also has an MS in civil engineering from the University of Oklahoma. And finally, we have Karen Hudson with us. Karen is a representative and an organizer like myself. She lives on a 5th generation farm in Illinois. She's a graduate of Illinois State University and has a bachelor's degree in education. She is a co-founder, and Danny's in there along with her, with Illinois Citizens for Clean Air and Water, excuse me. So you're coming from a reference point of what we at SRAP do on a daily basis. And I think to start this panel off, I'd like to go to Karen Hudson, who has had much experience working with communities that are dealing with these emissions from CAFOs, from factory farms. Karen, if you can paint a picture for the audience of what communities experience that live near these facilities.
Well, the picture that I'm going to paint is not a very appetizing picture. They are exposed to more than just odor. It is a stew of emissions. So if odor disappeared, we would still be suffering from those emissions. And these folks are breathing in and are exposed to the emissions that come from inside the building, the dust, particles of skin, bugs, disinfectants, antibiotics, and other medicines used in the production area, dried urine and feces. And then, of course, there's about 160 gases that are all combined with that, in addition to the particulates, which the tiny pieces that I just spoke about, they're carried into the air and they come off site. And folks that I work with show symptoms of what happens when they are being exposed off site to these pollutants and pathogens. The ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, we all hear about hydrogen sulfide. It is a potent gas that smells like rotten eggs. And people are exposed to this, experience neurological problems. In fact, low levels of this gas will cause permanent neurological damage that's irreversible. So the folks that I work with, their lives are very much affected. I have a client that has a yellow ribbon on her clothesline, and she will only go outside of her house for a walk if it's blowing in one direction. If it's blowing from the other direction, it means that her yard and home are being exposed to those emissions. So to have a sign like that before you even open your door, it's unspeakable. These emissions are also getting inside the home. They found antibiotic-resistant pathogens and funguses inside of homes downwind. I have a client who, when she does her laundry at night, if she puts her last load in and then goes to sleep in the morning, if she has forgotten to take that out at night and the wind shifts, her laundry will smell exactly like the raw sewage coming from these facilities. Neighbors in my community were forced to burn candles at night just to keep the odors down in their room. So this crosses the line of the property. It invades your personal space. And once you're breathing this, it's not just in your nose and breathing out. Those molecules are actually absorbed by your body. So the emissions really, really affect people. Elderly people, immunocompromised, infants, young children, they're more affected than most people. So there's a whole world of impacts, but those are the folks that really suffer the most.
So that's a great description. Kathy, I want to go to you to educate the listeners about where these emissions are coming from and what you have seen in terms of how this can impact a community. What are they being exposed to and how are they being exposed?
Okay. So first of all, there's different kinds of capos, right? You have hog facilities that might have their animals inside a barn on a slatted floor, and the feces and urine that are defecated by the animals, they go through the slatted floor and end up in a deep pit underneath. So it's basically a slurry of fecal material and urine. Isn't that lovely to speak about? But anyway, that slurry decomposes. It continues to decompose as it's being held in storage. And like for hog facilities, there's something called pit fans, which are fans that are located along the perimeter of the barn that suck out the contaminated air right above that manure that's held in storage. So that is actually the most concentrated contaminants. In fact, there's some research out of Iowa that says that 70% of the air emissions from a hog CAFO comes from the pit fans. And so it's going to be mainly ammonia. Of course, there's going to be methane, that has no odor, but is an explosive problem. There'll be ammonia, which is the degradation of the urine. You know, your urine the hog has urine, which is urease, and the urease degrades to ammonia. The ammonia becomes saturated in the fecal slurry, and it escapes as a gas. So that is blown out of the pit fans along with hydrogen sulfide gas, which is generated because the fecal material in the deep pits is in an anaerobic situation, and anaerobic decay of proteins generates hydrogen sulfide gas. There's also a lot of volatile organic acids that are generated, and that's from the degradation of protein. So if you think of the fecal material, that's where undigested proteins are excreted from the body, and those proteins continue to degrade as they sit in that pit. And there's a group of microorganisms that will degrade proteins down to volatile organic acids, which are highly odoriferous. And then there's another group of bacteria that will eat the volatile organic acids and generate methane and CO2 and water. because it's just a slurry and not a designed anaerobic system, the degradation doesn't go to its fruition. So mostly what is expelled out of the hog barns is volatile organic acids. And I kind of explain that as like spaghetti sauce. So, mostly spaghetti sauce is water and tomatoes with a little bit of garlic and some spices. What you smell when you're cooking it is the garlic, but the vast majority of it is water and tomatoes. Similarly, what's coming out of a hog facility would be mostly ammonia and methane. But the very small amount, the garlic part, is the volatile organic acids that even at parts per billion, our nose detects it because these are chemicals of decay of protein. And our bodies know that we do not need to be around decaying animals or decaying protein, that's not a healthy place to be. So our body reacts quite negatively over it. Does that make sense? And so that's what happens at a hog farm. At a dairy farm, where they have freestyle barns and the animals are inside, and they have an alley between where they lay down and where they eat, where the animals defecate, and then the facility will wash down or maybe even scrape that alley into a liquid system that goes to a lagoon. And so the emissions out of that type of barn are much less than would be out of a hog barn, because the manure and all of the volatile organic acids are actually held out in the lagoon. So the first thing you have to ask yourself is what type of system the animal facility has and what type of animal there is. So I've mentioned 2 liquid manure systems. The third type would be a dry manure system, such as a broiler facility raising poultry. And this is where the poultry are inside a barn on litter or sawdust shavings of some sort, and they're defecating inside the barn. The sawdust absorbs the ammonia from their defecation, and then because that ammonia is very toxic to the birds, the ventilation system is designed to expel the air inside the barn, to move it, to have a turnover of the air quite rapidly, to keep the ammonia emissions below 25 parts per million inside the barn. And so from a poultry facility, you're actually getting the ammonia plus dust from the litter, and also dust from the feed and feathers. So their emissions are going to look different on the outside of the barn than, say, from emissions from a hog facility. So you're going to see a lot of feathers. You're going to see a lot of orange dust all over the grass underneath the ventilation fans, and that would be the feed that has been blown out of the barns. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yes,
but that
yes,
gives
you
you an
did.
idea.
And you painted a brilliant picture, and I think that's very helpful to the communities to understand the whole processes. So I'm going to go to Danny now to talk about some of the legal issues. So we have laws in this country that are supposed to protect us, federal laws, the Clean Air Act. Talk to us about the federal laws and the state laws, and why we can't seem to get this under control when we're talking about agriculture.
That is such a good question, Maria. And before I go into that part, I just wanted to build on a couple things that Kathy and Karen had mentioned, which is these odors, and people living near these facilities, they experience odors, and that becomes an irritant. Those odors really are indicators of pollutants that you're being exposed to. And there's good peer-reviewed research out there that really does show that. So when a community or a person is living next to a confinement operation and you get these odor plumes, it's not just a bad smell. Those odors carry with it pollutants, and those are almost indicators of pollutants that you're breathing in. And so I think that's just an important thing that people need to remember, because often when community groups that we work with complain to environmental regulatory agencies that are supposed to be regulating these things, and they complain about the odors, their concerns are not necessarily taken very seriously, because they say, oh, you're sensitive to the odors and it's just normal farming operations. But in fact, it's not. And if the odors are coming and they're overpowering, that's a sign that you're being exposed to something. So I just wanted to make that point. But getting into the laws that are in place to regulate CAFOs, there are several. The one that I want to talk about mostly is the Clean Air Act. That is the primary federal law that regulates air emissions from sources of pollution all over the country. And the Clean Air Act doesn't specifically identify CAFOs as what they would call a stationary source that are regulated under the Clean Air Act. However, if a CAFO emits a certain amount of pollution and a certain type of pollution, it could meet emissions thresholds that then would trigger the Clean Air Act. And the Clean Air Act has mechanisms to try to help control and monitor the pollution that's coming from these facilities. So a few of the pollutants that are regulated under the Clean Air Act that are common in CAFOs, I guess two that I see are most common, and I would ask Karen and Maria and Kathy to chime in, because I believe that you all have just as much, if not more, knowledge about this than I do. But particulate matter pollution and ozone, or volatile organic compounds. Those are two big ones that we see with CAFOs. PM emissions are the particulates that come out often of poultry operations, and those are tiny dust particles that can end up very deep in the lungs. And then the VOCs, or volatile organic compounds, those are also pollutants that can have an impact on public health and safety. So they are pollutants of concern, and those are two of the main categories of pollutants that are criteria pollutants under the Clean Air Act that are regulated. And so if you have a livestock facility or a confinement operation that is exceeding what the thresholds are for emitting those pollutants, then the Clean Air Act would come in as something to regulate these facilities. Now, EPA has looked at CAFOs, and they've been looking at CAFOs for a very long time. And in 2005, they decided that they needed more information to make it easier to do implementation and enforcement of the Clean Air Act against CAFOs, because it was hard to measure the emissions from those facilities. And so the EPA entered into what was called, I think, the National Air Compliance Consent Agreement with AFOs across the country, animal feeding operations. And if you were an animal feeding operation, this is back in 2005, and you agreed to participate in the study, then that was going to go to help EPA and the industry figure out how to best measure these emissions, because up to that point, they were enforcing the Clean Air Act more on a case-by-case basis. So that being said, that happened in 2005. And when EPA issued that air compliance consent agreement and final order, a lot of CAFOs had the opportunity to sign up to participate in that study. And if they did participate in that study, they received some immunity from some enforcement if they were found to be exceeding air pollution thresholds. However, if you were a CAFO and you didn't sign up for the study, then you didn't receive that immunity. And so it was very clear in the rulemaking that's in the Federal Register that EPA considered that they would continue to enforce the Clean Air Act, and that states that were implementing the Clean Air Act should continue to enforce the Clean Air Act, but that ultimately this air emissions monitoring study would lead to better, more consistent methodologies to measure these emissions. And so that's a long story to where we are today, because what we have been experiencing in the field for many years, and probably since 2005 or earlier, is when communities are complaining to EPA or states that have that regulatory authority to implement the Clean Air Act, they're often being told that that the Clean Air Act doesn't apply, or there aren't adequate emissions methodologies to be able to regulate them. And that's not necessarily true. And the air study has been completed. EPA has published some draft emissions estimate methodologies, so methodologies to estimate emissions to get some consistency across the board. They just issued some draft emissions methodologies that are out for public comment, I believe still now in 2020 for swine operations. But this has been a long, drawn-out process. But it doesn't necessarily mean just because EPA is doing this study that the Clean Air Act doesn't apply to Capos, because it does. And the reason why I've done this long sort of narrative about where, things have come with EPA looking at Capos and where we are today is oftentimes in communities that we're working with, we confront a lot of resistance when we know certain facilities are exceeding pollution thresholds and should be regulated under the Clean Air Act, and they're not. And it's very difficult to get states to actually take action.
So that is a great analysis of what should be happening. Now that's going to bring up another segment because often things that should be happening don't happen within agriculture. And that is because sometimes we hit a brick wall with the will to do things. One thing I'm going to bring in that you just reminded me of, well, a couple of things you just reminded me of. One is in Maryland, we were trying to get the local communities, were trying to get some protection through possibly setbacks because of the science of the emissions. We had a gentleman that was trying to put 13 very large poultry houses in, and the folks were worried about what they were breathing in. They had gone through the democratic process, went to their county, and what was told to them was, when they were bringing in science, is, well, this is from Pennsylvania or this is from this state, and we were in Maryland at the time. And it was interesting because the researchers were saying ammonia is ammonia is ammonia. It doesn't matter which state that it is. It still has the same effects. But again, this gets into the politics. So the citizens, it was interesting because DPI, which is the Delmarva Poultry Industry, a trade group for the industry here, was telling local government, look, we need Maryland data. So the folks went and they got legislation to get data. That was all the legislation was calling to do. And interestingly, the industry fought it and actually was meeting behind closed doors with the regulatory agency, the industry, and a foundation. And they ended up, in the end, ultimately killing the bill. But guess who wasn't at the table? The citizens that sit there and have to breathe it. Yes. And that is very offensive. So I think somewhere politics is playing on why citizens aren't protected. Karen, I want to go back. Look,
I'd love to talk about that for a second.
Go ahead. Please.
What is so interesting about the Clean Air Act is that it's a permitting system. And the industry wants good emission factors, which would be so many pounds of pollutant per animal per day. And then you can multiply that by the number of animals you have, and then you have a total pounds of pollutant per day and then per year. And a trigger for a minor permit under the Clean Air Act is 10 tons per year. A trigger for a Title V major permit is 100 tons per year. So most of the Capos, 1,000 animal units and above, would most likely trigger a minor permit. And those are state-issued permits. that the state can determine how the permit is written, what's required of the industry to monitor or reduce their pollutants. But when you get into the Title V permit, or the major air pollutant source, which is 100 tons per year, which, for example, would be like a 2 million head egg layer facility, that would be a Title V permit. Then, that's a major permit, so it's a bigger deal, but still, it is permission to emit. Okay, and so the fact that the industry wants to fight the development of local emission factors doesn't make any sense, because those emission factors just determine which permit you would get, whether you would get a minor permit or a major permit. You'd have to pay a permit fee, you'd have to do some monitoring, you'd have to do some reporting, but it's not going to put you out of business. The best case scenario is that there would be an opportunity for the public to require best available control technology. And that is where the benefit is for the people living around the facilities. But there's industries all over the country, manufacturing businesses, automobile facilities, electric power plants, every kind of manufacturing facility you can think of has a Clean Air Act permit. So it does not prevent industry from operating or being profitable. It is just a measure. It's a way to measure the amount of pollution in a region, to keep track of it, and hopefully make some plans to reduce the most toxic and hazardous elements of that pollution, and to keep an eye on you know what I'm saying? To keep an eye on the national ambient air quality, and to keep that at a healthy place. So industry it's not to their benefit to fight it. It doesn't make sense.
And I just want to tag on to what Kathy mentioned. Well, she mentioned a few very important things, but the Clean Air Act doesn't eliminate these facilities from polluting, but it tries to control the pollution. So it places limits and then the technology to try to control it. So it's limiting the effects on people. And you have areas that are considered non-attainment areas, for example, for ozone. Every state may have one or two non-attainment areas, which means they are not attaining the air quality that they're supposed to under the Clean Air Act. And so if you're in a non-attainment area, then the level of the amount or type of pollution that you're allowed to emit in those areas is lower. And then the standards here on how you have to control that pollution in those areas. And so it shouldn't be something that the industry fears. What it would do if industry, the states and EPA were actually doing proper implementation and enforcement was it would actually put the industry in a position where they have to come up with these best available technologies to control the pollution, which right now isn't necessarily occurring in the right way. And Maria,
right.
you mentioned
also,
politics.
Let me just tag onto that, is that there are control technologies for air pollution that industry has utilized. There are biofilters that are used for food manufacturing, and there's biofilters for hog facilities. There are screening facilities. There's filters. There's incineration of the pollutants. These are all control technologies that are used by industry that could be borrowed and used by ag industry. So there's no technological barrier to the industry stepping up to the plate and taking responsibility for basically uncontrolled emissions of pathogens, respiratory chemicals like ammonia, etc., and controlling them and basically destroying them so that they're not collecting in the environment. And industry has been crying for the last 20 years that they just can't do it, but every other industry has managed to do it. So we're just saying that the line needs to be drawn. We're tired of waiting. There are emission factors. They were based on good science, and the industry needs to start using them, and states need to start implementing their authority to write air permits for Capos.
Yeah.
And I don't want to monopolize the conversation too much, Maria, but I just want to add to 3 points that Kathy made. The first one is there are emissions estimating methodologies out there, and there is a lot of great data for these facilities to be able to measure their emissions and really know whether or not they're exceeding pollution thresholds and whether or not they should be, come under the umbrella of the Clean Air Act and these regulations. There is enough data out there for them to do that now, today. And so that's number one. Number two is getting back to politics. I'll just speak from personal experience, and I won't name names, but I know in cases that we've worked on in the past where we knew certain facilities were definitely exceeding those thresholds, where they, even before construction, they would have needed to get what's called new source review. When you're creating a new pollution source, and particularly if you're in a non-attainment area, you really have to put in the highest standard air pollution control technology that you can. And so with facilities that we knew were coming in, we knew based on their size, their type, that they would be hitting those thresholds, that they should be regulated under the Clean Air Act and get this new source review, which is basically like a construction type permit. You have to get the new source review before you can construct, and they want to make sure that you construct to these higher standards to control pollution. So that's the idea behind that new source review. In the cases that we've really tried to get the attention of EPA on, and we know that the emissions are at those thresholds, that Title V under the Clean Air Act is what's triggered. We need new source review. I have had sidebar conversations with officials at US EPA to say, we agree with you. We understand that this facility or these facilities do trigger these requirements, but we're dealing with politics, not only at the federal level, but at the state level too. And so that is a lot of what's happening, is politics is getting in the way of proper regulation. And the Clean Air Act's intended to protect public health and safety. And it's politics that is really controlling what's happening out there, when states and EPA really have the ability to do some things in terms of enforcement and implementation. And they know oftentimes that they should, but they can't because of certain politics, at least in some cases.
Right. So I want to bring Karen in here because I know Karen has had many experiences with communities and politics and the impact that can have on protecting communities. So Karen, would you like to add anything in here?
Well, I'd like to say, they have tried to take local control away from everyone and have just about achieved that. And when a low-level nuclear waste site or garbage dump type of facility move into our neighborhoods, we have a voice in local control where we can lobby our elected officials on the county level, and they are able to make a decision whether this is going to be a good idea and a good investment in the community. And when I see these facilities that have 5,000 to 10,000 head of animals that is producing waste of a city-sized waste, we have no local control over that. And agriculture is the sacred cow, so to say. But this is a different type of agriculture than original agriculture. It's producing industrial strength toxics. People 3 to 4 miles away and even farther are being impacted with asthma-like symptoms, reduced lung capacity. The peer-reviewed research that we have now compared to even 10 or 15 years ago, there's so much that comes in every month showing that this is a public health issue. And the National Association of Local Boards of Health discussed this. The NACHO, or the National Association of City and County Health Officials, have called for a moratorium and more research and stronger laws on this. The American Public Health Association renewed their call for a moratorium last year, just late last year in 2019, calling for a moratorium and more research until the public health effects are addressed. And the public has spoken. They have done the first national survey of residents and citizens about this issue. And the majority of people are calling for stronger laws to protect their public health because it's obviously not happening.
I'm so glad that you brought that up. I also want to, gosh, time flies. I told you, we ladies could be on here for days talking about this because it's just such an injustice. One thing that I want to throw out there is we have seen in the past few years the size of these facilities really growing. I'll just give you an example here from the Eastern Shore. You know, it has been decades. Folks have had 400-foot house, a farm family, you know, possibly 2. Now we are seeing, I'm going to play a clip at the very end when we sign off. But in West Virginia, I just got a case. We're talking about an investment firm, not a family farm, an investment firm that is building 20 houses that are 700 feet long. It's getting longer and longer. The size of these houses, the model changed. The economic model has changed within industry. They are way out of control in terms of what used to be a normal size facility. If you want to even call that normal, but it's really grown. And we have 20 houses at that site. As the crow flies, another 15 houses by the same investment firm, 35 houses. On one site, you're talking about millions and millions and millions of birds in 1 year being produced. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about unhealthy air. So, God, we're almost at
Maria,
the end.
can I add something? Maria,
yeah,
can I add something?
Yeah, I'm going to go around and I'm going to give each of you, like, you know, a minute to go and put closing thoughts in there. And I suggest we do another panel in the future. Go ahead, Karen, start us off.
Okay. You know, we're talking about emissions, and research is now finding that there's something called methicillin resistant staph, or MRSA. Many of you have probably heard of that. People die of MRSA in hospitals every day. There's community associated MRSA, hospital associated MRSA, where you pick that up in a hospital. There's community associated, where you get it in the community, outside of a setting of a hospital. And now there's livestock associated MRSA, which is called LA MRSA. And it is circulating in the environment. What we are seeing in Iowa and Pennsylvania, recent research has found that the closer that you live to a facility like this, a very large confined animal feeding operation, the more likely you are to be colonized with methicillin-resistant staph. It does not mean that you're sick with it. It just means that you're colonized, that your body is harboring this. And if you go into the hospital for surgery or contract a soft skin tissue infection, you're more likely to come down with a full-blown MRSA, or antibiotic-resistant staph infection. In Pennsylvania, they found that people that even live near manure application sites, even if your residence isn't directly next to a facility, if you reside near a site where they're actually applying manure, they're showing that they're experiencing more MRSA-associated soft skin tissue infections. So the antibiotic resistance part of these emissions is another factor that's really playing into public health. And we're going to see more research on that as the years go on. And it's very important to know that just shutting the door and closing the windows is not stopping this bacteria from entering your home. We're finding it inside homes downwind from these facilities. So again, I stress that the antibiotic resistant part of the emissions, of this soup of emissions, is very, very dangerous, and we need to really control this. Thanks.
Thanks for adding that. Danny, 90 seconds. Close us off, and then we're going to jump to Kathy for very, very final thoughts.
Okay, so I focused on the Clean Air Act today. I want to make it known that states can and should do more than what the Clean Air Act does. And that is something that is very important to note. So there might be different regulations in different states that apply, and it just depends on what state you're in. But states should either be implementing it, or oftentimes they have their own set of air regulations that might be applicable. But when I'm talking about the Clean Air Act, I think it's very important for people to understand two things. Number one, there are citizen suit provisions, which means if the regulatory agencies that is responsible for implementing and enforcing that act isn't doing its job, isn't diligently prosecuting a violator, citizens actually have the ability to step in the shoes of the agency and do that enforcement themselves. That's sometimes easier said than done, but that is available to people under the Clean Air Act. The other thing I want to mention is that oftentimes not all capos are going to be regulated under the Clean Air Act. You might have to be a certain size, you have to emit a certain type of pollution. And so if you're complaining to an agency, you want to be sure that those triggers are there. But let's say they are. Very often, what regulatory agencies tell people, and Maria, we experienced this in one of the states that she works in commonly, is that, oh, no, agriculture is exempt from the Clean Air Act. That is not true in the case of capos. Many states even have exemptions under their state laws for ag, but capos, and if you're a major source of pollution, you're regulated under the Clean Air Act. And so if you hit a wall like that, and you are being told this industry is exempt, I think that should always be questioned.
Good point. And in that case, call Kathy or Danny, and Kathy will put the hammer down. Kathy, final thought.
Okay, so the main reason to focus on the Clean Air Act is we're looking for public participation, and it does require a public notice and public comment period associated with the permit. If your state doesn't have local control at the county level, you may not even know a capo is being built until they get a Clean Water Act permit. But a Clean Air Act permit would also increase your knowledge ahead of time. That's important to know. The earliest that you can learn that there's a capo going to be across the street from you, the better you're going to be positioned to gather enough knowledge in order to challenge the permit and maybe challenge the location of that facility. And my last closing words are, and I speak directly to industry, if you do not believe that you are generating a pollutant or pollution that adversely impacts our health and our environment, if you don't believe that, then how can we trust you to control it? And I say that almost monthly. We need an industry that's honest, that will come to the table, that agrees there are very reliable emission factors, that will start estimating their emissions and start becoming a vital member of the discussion of how we protect our public health in our communities and across our great nation. Thank you so much.
And I will add my final words to this. One of my passions, and all the ladies on the screen will agree with this, is that unfortunately, most of the communities that we see these facilities going in are communities that lack political power. They are environmental injustice communities. So if you need help, if something is coming into your community, as you can see, SRAP, we are a dedicated team to helping communities, trying to advocate for policy that is protective of public health, of the environment, of so many things that encompass the everyday lives of rural America. We have great family farms. We have people that want to feed their communities and they care about the environment. So please support your family farmer and contact Socially Responsible Agricultural Project. We are here to help you. Thank you.
The construction you see is a mega poultry site. The plans are for 19 houses. Each house can hold 50 to 70,000 chickens at a time. That's almost 1 million birds on site at a given point. They also do about 5 or 6 rotations per year. Pilgrim's Pride brings the chicks in. 2 months later, they're large broiler chickens that are moved back to the plant for processing. So we're looking at 5 to 7 million chickens a year they're going through here, and we're very concerned about the health effects to the citizens in this area. There's also the concern about the odor, and of course property values. There are studies have been conducted, different parts of the country that show that property values, decrease significantly, once these mega farms go in.
Anderson River no longer has the water quality anymore to support trout. You can't find the game fish anymore because the water quality got down. This is 100-year-old barn we're working on. It's our granddad's barn. So we got all kinds of history in here. So when you start talking about putting a whole bunch of stinking chicken houses right along Route 220 back through here, it doesn't work. You think, what's going to happen to the guy that has 3 chicken houses? But here comes 19, and they have to keep these things stocked up, and they're going to give him the best chickens and priority over the little guy who's got 3 or 4 chicken houses who's trying like heck to make a living.
They change the quality of the birds?
They can change the quality of the birds depending on whether you are a favorite son or not. And
oh no!
If you fuss and cuss and carry on and raise Cain and make the powers that be unhappy, you will not get as good a quality birds. We got deep roots in here. They're talking about coming in here and wrecking the whole blooming farm down there across the road from the sewer plant.
Years ago you had a barn, you had cattle and some hogs and sheep and chickens. That was agricultural. It didn't count these big commercial operations, and that's probably part of the zoning problem, is that nobody thought of that. So it is zoned agricultural, but in the context of agriculture in this county, it's like this. You have a barn, pond, if you had 50, 75 head of cattle, not 25 houses, and
I think it's
that's a different
600,000
concept.
I'm getting more comfortable.
Okay, so here we go. We're going dark.
It came with Mel Gibson. Freedom!
When I could see you. Yeah, that's right. That's right. There you go. All right, good luck, folks.